Tina Turner spent her life believing her mother carried significant Native American ancestry, Cherokee and Navajo blood running through the family from the Tennessee hills. Then a DNA test replaced that belief with something she had never imagined: not one African people, 5, spread across the width of a continent, from the Central African rainforest to the East African Rift Valley, and a third of her genome pointing somewhere else entirely. This is the true ancestry of Tina Turner. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and subscribe. She was not born Tina Turner. She was born Anna Mae Bullock on November 26, 1939 in Brownsville, Tennessee. She was born at Poindexter Farm on Highway 180, where her father worked as an overseer of sharecroppers. The community she grew up in was called Nutbush. It was unincorporated, rural, and built almost entirely around the cultivation of cotton. She picked cotton as a child. The world she came from was not abstract history. It was soil and labor in a specific stretch of West Tennessee that had been shaped by the plantation system long before she arrived, and that would carry those marks long after she left. Her father, Floyd Bullock, was a deacon. Her mother, Zelma, carried the ancestry stories. Cherokee and Navajo blood on her side, significant Native American heritage passed down, with the kind of conviction that comes not from speculation, but from genuine belief. It was not a casual claim. It was identity. It was part of how the family understood themselves in relation to the land they lived on and the history that had put them there. When Tina was 11, her mother left. The marriage had been troubled for years, and Zelma's departure was sudden. She simply went, seeking freedom from a situation that had become untenable. Her father remarried not long after and moved to Detroit. Tina and her sister were sent to live with their maternal grandmother in Brownsville. The family story about Native American ancestry went with them, carried forward through the disruption the way family stories tend to travel, in pieces, through the people who still remembered enough to repeat them. She left Tennessee in her mid-teens, following her sister to St. Louis. She would not go back in any permanent sense. The girl who had grown up picking cotton on Highway 180 became one of the most recognized performers in the world, but she carried Nutbush with her in ways that went beyond the song she eventually wrote about it. What she also carried, without knowing it, was a genetic record of the people who had come before her. That record told a different story than the one she had grown up believing. The belief in Native American ancestry was not unusual in Tina Turner's family. It was not unusual in most African American families across the South, across Tennessee, across the Carolinas, across Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. The same story repeated itself in household after household across generations. A grandmother with Cherokee blood, a great-grandfather who was part Navajo, an ancestor who had lived among indigenous people and left something of themselves behind. The specifics varied. The conviction rarely did. For millions of African American families, the belief in indigenous ancestry was not a rumor or a wish. It was received knowledge, passed down with the same certainty as a surname or a church affiliation, treated as historical fact by people who had every reason to trust the elders who had told them. Understanding why that belief was so widespread requires sitting with what the American South actually was in the generations following emancipation. Formerly enslaved people and free people of color had, in specific regions and time periods, lived in proximity to indigenous communities. Genuine mixing had occurred. The historical record confirms it in places, certain communities in the Carolinas, certain settlements along river routes through Tennessee and Georgia, where the populations had overlapped and intermarried and built lives in the margins that the formal record rarely bothered to document. That history was real. What the family stories had done over generations was expanded it. A connection that existed somewhere in the ancestral record, perhaps genuinely, perhaps only approximately, had grown in the telling until it became a defining characteristic rather than a footnote. Physical features that families interpreted as markers of indigenous ancestry, particular hair textures, bone structure, the specific quality of certain skin tones, were read as confirmation of what the elders had always said. The interpretation was sincere. The evidence it was built on was partial. Zelma Bullock passed the belief to her daughter in good faith. It was part of the story of who they were. It had survived displacement and loss, and the particular kind of silence that settles over families that have been through too much to explain everything. What it had not survived was a laboratory. The paper trail for Tina Turner's family runs further than most. The paper trail for her line matters. That is not a small thing. For African American families with roots in the Deep South, the documentary record almost always stops at the same place, the years immediately following emancipation, where the Freedmen's Bureau files and the 1870 census begin to record people who had previously existed in the official record only as numbers in a column. Before that line, the documents were not designed to preserve identity. They were designed to preserve property values, names, origins, family relationships. None of these were considered worth recording for people whose legal status made such information irrelevant to the purposes of the system that was doing the recording. Tina Turner's family line reaches further than that boundary in one specific direction. Her maternal great-grandfather's older brother was a man named George Flagg. After emancipation, George Flagg did something with what little freedom and land access had left him. He sold a portion of his property to the local school trustees. That land became Flagg Grove Elementary School, a one-room schoolhouse in the Nutbush community where black children would receive an education in the decades following the Civil War. Tina Turner attended Flagg Grove Elementary School as a child, the same land, the same building, generations apart, connected by a single act of a freed man who decided that what he could do with what he had was build something permanent. The school still exists. It has been preserved and relocated to a heritage center in Brownsville, Tennessee, where it now sits as a testament to exactly the kind of community self-determination that the post-emancipation South was designed to make impossible. That detail is not incidental. It is a window into what the documentary record occasionally preserves when the right conditions align. A freed man, a piece of land, a transaction recorded because land transactions were worth recording. It does not answer the deeper question. It does not reach back across the Atlantic. It does not name the peoples whose descendants built what became Tina Turner's family. For that, the paper trail ends here and something else begins. In 2008, Henry Louis Gates Jr. brought his PBS documentary series African American Lives back for a second installment. The first series in 2006 had traced the ancestry of 8 prominent African Americans using genealogical research and DNA analysis. The response had been significant enough, emotionally, culturally, and in terms of audience, that a second series was commissioned. This time the participants included Morgan Freeman, Chris Rock, Maya Angelou, and Tina Turner. The methodology Gates's team used was not the kind of DNA test available to consumers at the time. It was a research-grade genetic analysis built on a purpose-assembled African database, genetic samples collected from populations across sub-Saharan Africa, specifically to allow the kind of continental comparisons that commercial tests could not make. The goal was not simply to tell participants how much of their DNA was African. That much was known in approximate terms by anyone who had thought about it. The goal was to go further, to identify with statistical precision which specific African populations a person's genome most closely resembled, to replace the broad category of African ancestry with something that pointed at particular places on the map and particular peoples with their own histories. The test combined autosomal DNA analysis, which captures ancestral contributions from all lines simultaneously, with mitochondrial DNA testing, which follows the direct maternal line unchanged through every generation. Together they built a layered picture. The autosomal results would show the breadth of Tina Turner's ancestral connections across multiple population groups. The mitochondrial results would follow a single unbroken thread back through her mother's mother, and every mother before that, reaching into a past that no document had ever touched. Before the results were presented, Gates addressed the limits of what the science could claim. A genetic affiliation with a particular population means a statistically significant similarity, not a confirmed genealogical line, not a certificate of descent, not a guarantee that a specific ancestor belonged to that specific group. The science points. It does not certify. Gates was precise about this distinction on camera because it mattered. What the science pointed to, in Tina Turner's case, pointed across an entire continent. The results arrived in two parts. The first addressed the belief Tina Turner had carried since childhood, 1%. That was the Native American ancestry figure her DNA returned, not absent. The science was careful to note what was there, but a fraction so small, it bore no relationship to the significant Cherokee and Navajo heritage her mother had described. The belief had not been fabricated. It had been inherited in good faith from people who believed it themselves. But the biological record did not support it at the scale the family story had suggested. Whatever indigenous ancestry may have entered the family line at some point, it had not left a significant genetic trace. What had left a trace was something the family had never spoken about, not because they were hiding it, because they had no way of knowing it was there. The autosomal results showed Tina Turner's genetic ancestry as 66% sub-Saharan African, 33% European, and behind those numbers, a more specific picture that the African database had been assembled precisely to reveal. Her African DNA did not match a single population. It matched 5. The Mbenzulile people of the Central African Republic, the Hausa of Nigeria, the Tuareg of Niger, the Bamileke of Cameroon, the Turkana of Kenya. 5 distinct peoples, identified through statistically significant genetic similarities, each representing a separate ancestral line reaching back into Africa from a different direction. Not one origin, but 5. Not one people, but a convergence, different histories, different geographies, different cultures, all arriving at the same point in a sharecropping family in West Tennessee. Gates presented this not as a curiosity, but as a map. Each of those peoples had a specific location on the continent. Each had been within the reach of the transatlantic slave trade, though through different routes and different time periods. The presence of all 5 in a single genome was not random. It was the genetic record of centuries of forced dispersal, of populations separated from their homelands and mixed across generations in ways that the people involved had no power to prevent or document. The family had believed they were part Cherokee. The DNA said they were part of Africa in 5 different ways. 3 of those 5 peoples carry histories that reach far enough and run deep enough to deserve more than a percentage on a chart. The Mbenzo are among the oldest continuous human populations on Earth. Forest hunter-gatherers of the Central African Republic, they have lived in the equatorial rainforest for longer than most human communities have existed anywhere. Their genetic lineage is not a branch of the human story, it is one of its deepest roots. The presence of Mbenzile ancestry in Tina Turner's genome connects her not to a recent community or a colonial-era population, but to a line of human beings whose way of life predates the formation of most of the world's major civilizations. That connection is not symbolic. It is biological. It is measurable. It is there. The Hausa of Nigeria represents something different. They built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in West African history, city-states that functioned as major centers of trade, scholarship, and political organizations centuries before European contact. The Hausa were not a people living at the margins of events. They were at the center of them, and their language became one of the most widely spoken on the continent. When the slave trade reached West Africa, the Hausa were among the peoples whose members were taken. The specific routes and the specific circumstances varied. The genetic result was that Hausa ancestry is now present in the genomes of African Americans across the United States. including in the DNA of a woman who grew up in a one-room schoolhouse in Nutbush, Tennessee. The Tuareg are the nomadic Berber-speaking peoples of the Sahara and the Sahel, a people whose survival across one of the harshest environments on Earth required a particular kind of resilience that had been tested across centuries of attempted conquest and never fully broken. They resisted Arab expansion. They resisted French colonialism. They maintained their culture, their language, and their way of life under pressures that had dismantled larger and better resourced societies around them. The Bamileke of Cameroon and the Turkana of Kenya complete the picture, each adding a distinct ancestral thread to a genome that spans the continent from its western forests to its eastern plains. This is not an abstract detail. It is a living, measurable map of lineage and laws. 5 peoples, 1 woman, a convergence that the family story had never come close to capturing. 33% European. In isolation, that number sits quietly. In the context of Tina Turner's family history, as sharecroppers in West Tennessee and in cotton country, and within a plantation economy that organized that landscape for generations before emancipation and continued to shape it long after, it does not sit quietly for long. The European ancestry present in her genome entered through the same mechanism it entered most African American genomes across the South. Slavery in the American South created conditions in which the European DNA now present in those genomes arrived not through willing unions, but through the specific circumstances the system made legal, routine, and unremarkable in its own records. The plantation economy was not simply an economic arrangement. It was a structure that created opportunities for violation that the law explicitly permitted and the record deliberately did not preserve. The European ancestors in Tina Turner's DNA left no paper trail connecting to her. No name, no county, no plantation document that closes the distance between a percentage and a specific person. What those ancestors left was measurable. Who they were is not. That asymmetry runs through African American genetic history at scale. The African ancestry can be named 5 peoples, 5 regions, 5 distinct histories. The European ancestry can only be quantified. The science can tell you how much. It cannot tell you who or where exactly or under what circumstances lives intersected in ways that were never meant to be acknowledged. The record was designed that way. The gap is not accidental. Tina Turner received this information with the same clarity she had brought to every other difficult truth her life had required her to absorb. She did not perform shock. She did not reach for a simpler version of what the results meant. What the DNA had returned was a picture considerably more complicated than the family story and considerably more honest. The Native American belief her mother had passed down was not a lie. It was an inheritance built from real observation and genuine conviction. The science had not dismissed it. It had placed it beside something larger, and the largest part of what remained was still ahead. She died in Küsnacht, Switzerland, on May 24, 2023, overlooking Lake Zurich. She was a Swiss citizen, 83 years old. The distance between that house on the lake and Poindexter Farm on Highway 180 is not a distance that can be measured in miles. It is a distance measured in what a human being can survive and build from the wreckage of what survival costs. What the DNA established is that the journey did not begin in Nutbush. It did not begin in Tennessee. It did not begin anywhere in the American South. It began in Africa, in 5 separate places, along 5 separate lines, through 5 distinct peoples whose descendants were carried across the Atlantic in circumstances none of them chose and deposited into a system designed to make the origins of that journey permanently unrecoverable. Then Benzold carried one of the oldest genetic lineages on Earth into a sharecropping family in West Tennessee. The Hausa brought the inheritance of one of West Africa's great civilizations. The Tuareg contributed the genetic thread of a people who had spent centuries refusing to be a race. The Bamileke and the Turkana completed a picture that stretched from the equatorial forest to the East African plains, a genome assembled not by intention, but by the specific violence of the slave trade operating across multiple routes over multiple centuries. George Flagg sold his land so children could learn to read. One of those children's descendants became the woman the world called Tina Turner. That chain of events is not metaphor. It is the documented record of a specific community finding ways to persist inside a system that had been designed to prevent exactly that. The name on her birth certificate was Anna Mae Bullock. The name the world knew was Tina Turner. The name the DNA returned was something that could not fit on a document. 5 peoples, a continent, a lineage reaching back to the oldest human populations on Earth, all arriving at a one-room schoolhouse in a cotton farming community in Haywood County, Tennessee. She carried all of it without knowing. The science, arriving 69 years into her life, simply made it visible. The DNA did not take anything from Tina Turner. It added to her. 5 African peoples spanning a continent, a European ancestry whose origins the plantation record can explain but not name, a maternal line reaching back through the oldest human populations on Earth. She was born Anna Mae Bullock in a sharecropping community in West Tennessee. Her ancestor built a school on that land. The ancestry behind that name crossed an ocean before it arrived there. Whose hands it passed through on the way is the part the science can only estimate. The names are gone. The DNA remains.